Mark, can you guys see the slide presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Lasagna Griggs. I'm Director of Grants and Scholarships at New York State Higher Education Services Corporation. And I'm joined this morning by Lisa Simpson, who's Director of School Relations, and Michael Turner, who will be answering your questions as you put them in the chat. So let's get started by first reviewing what are the financial aid updates for the year 24 and 25. Our agenda includes an overview of the Future Act as well as the FAFSA Simplification Act. We will talk about how the EFC is replaced by SAI. We'll talk about changes to the Pell Grant eligibility formula, some updates to the FAFSA form itself, and we also have a list of resources that are available to you and your students. First, let's begin with the discussion of why are all these changes coming about? Well, the changes began with the passage of the Future Act, and it's not a movie. It's actually an acronym that stands for Fostering Undergraduate Talent by Unlocking Resources for Education Act. Now, this was passed back in December of 2020, and the act itself expands access to federal student aid for many students, and there are many mandated changes to the FAFSA form, as well as the formula that's used to determine eligibility for federal student aid. The FAFSA Simplification Act was signed into law also December 2020, and it introduced legislation that made significant changes to the FAFSA form itself, the application that we're all used to. So that is looking at eligibility calculations, Pell Grants to needier students. There's a new Pell Grant formula, and there's also a new student experience as they're filling out the application itself. There's fewer questions, but there's more responses to the questions that are available. So here we have a look at how the implementation has been done. So it may be tiny print, so I apologize for that, but we started the process of implementing FAFSA simplification with the 21-22 academic school year. And that was when certain pieces of legislation were repealed. And then it went on to 22-23, where you would have seen the removal of the drug conviction question and the removal of the question of selective service. So that was the beginning of the FAFSA Simplification Act. For the year 23-24, we still had the removal of the drug conviction question and selective service, but there was an addition by adding a demographic survey. You may have remembered students being prompted with a few questions before they entered the FAFSA that asked for gender and race and ethnicity and a couple of other demographic questions. For the school counselor side, some of the other changes included an expanded acceptability of documentation for homeless students. And it also provided additional information for professional judgments that you could write letters on behalf of your students to colleges to let them know that you are aware of the students' extenuating circumstances. And now let's fast forward to where we are now. Can you believe it? We've been at this process since 21-22, and we're finally at 24-25, where we're looking at significant changes to the application itself. So we're going to go over those changes that are occurring for 24-25. We start first with some terminology. We used to see an EFC, estimated family contribution, but now that is being placed by student aid index. The terminology or the definition is still the same. It is a number used to determine federal student aid eligibility. And with SAI, Student Aid Index, the formula for the 24-25 year is a little bit different. Their simplified needs test formula, as well as the automatic zero EFC formula, have been eliminated, but there are still formulas for students who are in certain tax filing statuses, certain income thresholds, and who are receiving certain means-tested benefit programs such as SNAP and Medicaid. The student aid index now, remember how you used to have an EFC of 0 and you would know that a student was eligible for maximum Pell Grant? where now the student aid index can be as low as a negative. It's not a misprint, as a negative 1,500. The lower the number, the higher the Pell Grant Award. And then there is still a standard Pell Grant Award for a 0 student aid index. There's also changes to the formula that determines a student's eligibility. In the past, for several years now, if a family owned a business that had less than 100 employees, they were not required to report the value of that business. Now, regardless of the value of the business, it must be reported on the application as an asset. And family farms did not have to report assets and value at all. But now for the 24-25 year, a family farm is included as an asset. The only part of the family farm that is not included is the family home, because a personal residence is not included as an asset on the application at all. There was a change to reporting of 529 programs. The 529 program in the past used to be reported for aggregated. The family reported the whole value of their 529 programs. Now the application only looks at the value of the account for the student, not any of the siblings or any other people. Child support is now an asset. It's not reported as income. So if a family is reporting that they received child support, it's not reported as income. It's listed in the assets section. And a new feature again is that child support is reported for the last 12 months. The application is looking at income from 2 years prior. So it's looking at 2022 income, but child support received is looking at the as an asset and the value of that for the last calendar year. And child support paid is no longer considered an allowance against income. In the past, if a family was paying child support, they could exclude that against income on the application, and that is now no longer the case. One of the questions that is on the application but not included in the formula is how many family members are attending college. So that is the number attending college is not in the formula. However, schools do have the ability, if they choose to do so, to perform professional judgment and count for more than one person attending college. And finally, the household size is derived from the exemptions on the tax return. And we'll go into a little bit more of that in the last few slides. If the tax return exemptions do not readily identify the number of people that are living in the household, then that can be manually adjusted on the application. So 24-25 Pell Grant eligibility is determined by income, family size, and poverty levels. So in the past, it's always been determined by income and family size. New for 24-25, poverty levels are used to determine maximum Pell Grant eligibility. So a person who has a negative student aid index of 1,500 will receive a maximum Pell Grant based on poverty levels. And a student who has a 0 EFC or student aid index will receive a lower award than the 1,500. So that is something that more information is coming out to financial aid offices to help them determine what a Pell Grant eligibility is. But the student will still see on their confirmation page, their FAFSA confirmation page, their Pell Grant eligibility. So that is not going away. So once they submit and get their confirmation summary, the amount of their Pell Grant will still be on that confirmation page. The Pell Grant is also adjusted for enrollment. There's a full-time award and a part-time award if the student is half-time, three-quarter time, or less than half-time. On the FAFSA confirmation page, the Pell Grant eligibility listed is that of a full-time student. So the student is assumed to be full-time. If they're going to enroll part-time, then the school makes the adjustment based on their enrollment status at that institution. So let's talk about some FAFSA updates. As you may have heard by now, The FAFSA form is delayed and will be available by December 31st. By statute, it has to be available by December 31st. So in my mind, that's January 1 of 2024, because that's the end of the year and most of you are out of school on your holiday break and not thinking about financial aid at all. So around January 2nd, it may come up on your radar as well as that of your students. So when a student files their FAFSA form, usually the student gets a confirmation page, and schools get what we call an ISAR. It's institutional information that is from the FAFSA, and schools get that information and they start to determine a student's eligibility for federal student aid. But schools, based on the changes that the federal student aid is having to implement for the 24-25 application season, they're actually implementing changes in stages to make sure everything goes right, because they such significant changes. You don't want to just put a product out there and hope everything goes right. No, you want to be able to make adjustments if necessary. And that is what the department is telling the financial aid community, that things will be released in stages. So the FAFSA form is becoming available by December 31st. Schools will start receiving that information anywhere between mid to end of January. So schools won't have the information at the time that the student is submitting it. So the colleges, information to the colleges will be delayed, which will also delay financial aid award offices for most colleges, because they won't have anything to award against without the FAFSA data. Applicants will receive their summary, but they will not be able to make corrections until the end of January as well. One of the significant changes that we're experiencing in the state of New York is that when a student reached the end of their application and they had the confirmation page, they could click on the link that says start your state application here. Well, the feds were not able to provide that information to us for the 24-25 year. We've been assured that it will be available for 25-26. So students can still click on the link that is at the end of the FAFSA form for the state of New York, but it will be a blank application, and the student will be filling in everything. If the student waits 2 weeks and gets their information, an email from New York State Higher Education Services Corporation that we have received their FAFSA, it will be pre-populated at that point, because we will have been able to do that on our own. So in another part of the presentation, I'll tell you the 3 ways that a student can do the TAP application. Even though the student can do the TAP application now, it has been available on our website since November 1st to celebrate our 50th anniversary of the TAP application. We still need the FAFSA. So the student must still submit the FAFSA in order for us to process their TAP application. One of the major changes to the FAFSA is the user experience. In order for a student to get into the application form, they need their FSA ID. Remember how you used to do FAFSA completions and you help a student do the FSA ID at the beginning or the end of the application? That is no longer an option. In order for them to do the FAFSA, they can't even access the application without an FSA ID. So the FSA ID is needed to even open up the FAFSA form. If a student doesn't have an FSA ID at the time they go to do the application, they can apply for an FSA ID, an account at that time, but they'll need to wait until they receive the email notification that their FSA ID account has been established and their identity has been verified. Another thing on the application is that the number of questions are reduced. It is also available in 11 most frequently spoken language by English learners in the US. So we have Spanish, Mandarin, Tagalog, Vietnamese, French, Arabic, Korean, Russian, German, Haitian Creole, and Hindi. Users, anyone whose income is submitted on the FAFSA form must have an FSA ID. And that is different from the past where only one parent needed an FSA ID along with the student, or if the parents were undocumented and didn't have a social security number, they did not have to have an FSA ID. Now going forward, effective with the upcoming year, everyone, whether they have a social security number or not, will need an FSA ID. The Department of Education is coming out with a process for those users or contributors who don't have a social security number, and that will be released the same time as the FAFSA form. For contributors who don't have a social security number, when they go to fill out the FSA ID, there is now a checkbox that says I don't have a social security number. Once they indicate they don't have a social security number, then they're prompted into the new process. But remember, that new process will not begin until the FAFSA is released. All users for FSA IDs will be required to create a username and a password, and they must have an email address. This is something new for 24-25, that anyone with an FSA ID must have an email address. For those individuals who don't have a social security number, the question becomes, how do you verify someone's identity? Well, they're verifying identity based on using knowledge-based questions. And so knowledge-based questions, if you ever go in to fill out something and say, did you own a red Honda Civic in 2005? So they're using those types of questions based on information that would have come from whichever credit bureau that they're using the information. They're not running a credit report. They're just pulling that information to determine if they can identify the individual requesting an FSA ID. The individual, if they verify, if their identity is verified, then they go through the normal process as any other student. But if their identity cannot be verified, the user will receive an email and they will have to submit documentation to authenticate their identity. That documentation includes, one, they are completing an attestation form, attesting to who they are, and then they have to submit proof. It could be a driver's license or a state issued ID, a foreign passport, or utility bill, or any other kind of ID. Now, some states do allow an individual with no social security number to get a driver's license. So, that's why they have that listed here as a document. They should receive confirmation, an email confirmation within 1 to 3 business days after they have uploaded their documentation or sent the documentation to federal student aid. The FAFSA form itself is going to be role-based. In the past, you had a student completing the application for themselves and their parents. This time, a student can't complete the information on behalf of the parent because the parent has to sign in with their own FSA ID. And that is done at the beginning of the application. So when a student or signs onto the application, they go through these role-based procedures. There's 4 steps that they go through in the interview process, and then they're signing into the application. At the beginning of the application, they're given their consent for the Internal Revenue Service to populate income information from their federal tax return if they filed one. So that is why everyone must have an FSA ID. They're giving consent. That future act allowed for federal student aid to draw information directly from the Internal Revenue Service into the FAFSA form. So the data retrieval tool is being replaced by the direct data exchange, where the Internal Revenue Service is populating the income. Based on our IRS code, they can't just give your income information to anybody. You have to give consent. So the FSA ID identifies the individual, and then the consent form is an authorization to allow the IRS to populate income information on the FAFSA form. A couple of other changes. There's no more save key. The save key was the password into the application, but now since you have to enter the application with your FSA ID, there's no need for the save key. And instead of 10 colleges, a student can list up to 20 colleges on their FAFSA form. Excuse me. So a little bit on the consent form. The consent form is required of the applicant, and if married, the applicant's spouse, and the parent, and if married, the parent's spouse. So the consent form also is authorizing the release of information to state entities like New York State Higher Education Services Corporation, so that we can receive that information, as well as colleges can receive the information in certain scholarship programs. There's only 2 scholarship programs that are right now allowed to receive the information from FAFSA data. So again, everyone whose income information is on the FAFSA must have an FSA ID. You know how we went from mother, father to parent 1, parent 2? Now anyone whose income information is on the FAFSA is called a contributor. So the contributor can be the parent, it can be the parent's spouse, it can be the student, it can be the student's spouse. If an individual whose income is on the application does not provide consent, the application can be submitted, but it will be rejected. A student aid index cannot be calculated if even one contributor does not give consent for tax information to be transferred to the FAFSA form. So the schools will receive the information, but they will not be able to process a financial aid award offer, because the FAFSA form itself, the results of the FAFSA are rejected because one individual refused to consent. So contributors, again, if it's a dependent student, the contributor could be the biological parents, the adoptive parents, or a step parent if the biological or adoptive parent has remarried, right? Grandparents' income information does not ever, never, ever go onto a FAFSA form. So it's only the biological adoptive parent or the step parent if the biological or adoptive parent has remarried. If the parents are married and file a joint tax return, then only one contributor is required. If the parents are married and they file separate tax returns, such as head of household or married filing separately, then both parents must have an FSA ID, and they're both considered contributors on the application. For a student who meets the definition of an independent student, if they're single, they're the only contributor on their application. However, if an independent student is married and the student files as married filing jointly, the spouse does not have to have an FSA ID. But if the student and their spouse filed separately, separate tax returns, then both of them will need to have an FSA ID. When the student is completing their application, they go in and they do their section. They sign in with their FSA ID. They complete their demographic information, the colleges that they're planning to attend. So they complete their portion of the application, and then they must provide the name, date of birth, social security number, and email address so that they can send an email to the parent so that the parent can be authorized to access the student's FAFSA form. So parents will get a secure email where the student has invited them to complete their section or the parent section of the application. Email reminders are sent to contributors after 45 days. If the contributor has not responded or gone into the application at all, then the application is purged and the student will have to start all over. So this is a sample view of what a student will see when they first go into the FAFSA form for the 24-25 year. So understanding the FAFSA form is one of 4 different sections of the application that is called the student experience. So there's a lot more text for students to read so that the department wants them to understand what they're doing and how their information is used and what happens after they file the FAFSA. So there's 4 parts to understanding the FAFSA form. I didn't take off the other logo. So we used the same presentation yesterday, but here is the definition for parent has changed for the federal student aid. It's no longer custodial parent or who the student lives with. It is based on who is providing the most support for the student. So if the parents are married, if the student's parents are married, both income information is reported on the application. But if the parents are not married and they live together, biological or adoptive, both of their information is reported on the application. If the parents are married and do not live together, this is one of the major changes. If the parents are not married and do not live together, you report the income of the parent who provided the most support in the past 12 months. Now, if the parents are remarried, then you provide the information for the step parent. So this is one of the major changes to the applications. How do you know who's providing the most support? Well, that is the parent's determination. So they should be able to determine who's providing the most support for their child, and is that income information that is reported on the application. If the parents are not married and do not live together, and they both provide the exact same report, then they will report information for the parent who has the greatest income and assets. So these questions, this screen here has the most questions. And the department is continuing to come out with more information to help not only you as school counselors and parents, but they're also helping schools to determine whose information should be provided on the FAFSA form. So this is the same slide. Dependency question is a new question. There's a new question on the application where a student can indicate that they have special circumstances and should be considered an independent student. When schools receive the information, they reach out to the student to see what their special circumstances are. And based on the student's response, the financial aid office may determine that the student warrants a dependency override or that parent income information is required. Here's a list of resources that are recommended so that you can get more information on the financial aid application process and how to help your students. One of my favorites is the financial aid toolkit. The FAFSA is now called the Better FAFSA, Better Future. So the financial aid toolkit has a 24-25 preview presentation. There's also a FAFSA prototype. And then they also have different fact sheets and webinars. Webinars are the training webinars that they've been doing over the past several months, since at least July. They've had several different webinars where they're explaining how the forms should be filled out. So I encourage you to take advantage of that, during your break when you have nothing else to do because you're bored not being at work. There's some federal student aid webinars that you can use you can view at your leisure, look at them with your favorite beverage in one hand and the remote switch in the other. There's also the one thing that financial aid professionals use is the FAFSA simplification system by the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. This is a free resource, so you don't have to be a member of NYSSCA to use that resource. And we have resources on our side as well at hesc.ny.gov that talks about the different changes that are coming in, as well as the TAP form.
Sonia, I just wanted to plug there's a 1 o'clock webinar that FSA is doing today on parent contributors. So there was a lot of questions in chat regarding what if a parent's divorced or, all those things. I put in a link to the registration for that. It's at 1 p.m. and that's being hosted today. So folks can join that if they have those questions and they want to see the guidance directly from the Department of Ed.
And Mike, they say that that was being recorded as well?
Yeah, they've been recording them all. Yeah. But
Okay.
I did put the registration link in there for folks who want to try to join today at 1 p.m.
So, I always sign up for the webinars because I know I can't attend when they're being offered, but I do review them later on. Okay. And then the last thing I want to mention on this particular presentation is that New York State Higher Education Services Corporation and New York State Financial Aid Administrators Association are providing an annual FAFSA and TAP forms training on January 5th. That is a Friday from 10 to 1 p.m. The FAFSA form is a little bit longer, so we opened up the training period for a little bit longer as well. This this training is free to everyone. You just heard Mike Turner. He'll be going over the TAP forms training, and I'll be going over the FAFSA forms step by step. The link is on this presentation, and it will be available. The presentation, I'll be sending it right after we're done with this event. So that is that part of the federal presentation. So we'll stop this share. Mike, are there any questions that we can call out that are common questions other than contributors?
So there was some confusion about contributors, but related to special circumstances. Can you just reaffirm that there's still that process in place where if a student has a legal guardian or special circumstance like they're homeless under McKinney-Vento, that they can still apply as independent, that hasn't changed?
Right. So students who do not live with their natural or biological or adopted parents, if they're living with a grandparent, aunt and uncle, or then there's a question on the application that says, are you in a legal guardianship situation? If they check that box, they don't provide parental information. If they indicate that they are homeless, then they don't provide parental information, but they do have to provide some type of documentation to prove homelessness. And a lot of times that is usually coming from the school counselor for a student who's graduating from high school, or some type of agency such as the Rescue Mission, the Salvation Army, or wherever homeless shelter they may be residing in. They can also provide documentation that they know that this individual is homeless. And it's not that they have to be homeless forever, it's just homeless at that time. And so we take that documentation and that is reviewed on an annual basis. So that has not changed. Then there are some students who have extenuating circumstances where both parents may be deceased, or it's in the student's best interest not to be in the family's household due to abuse. So those students too can petition the financial aid office to be considered an independent student based on their unique circumstances, and that will allow them to be considered an independent student. Any other questions Mike, any other questions that we need to go over as a group?
No, I think we could go on with the state session, Sonia.
Okay. So the state session, Mike Turner did this presentation yesterday, so I hope I do the same justice that he did yesterday. Here we go. Okay, am I still sharing or no? No, good.
We can see it now.
Okay. All right. So New York State aid. I've mentioned some of the things that are happening for the state of New York, but this presentation goes over everything that we have going on for the state of New York. So as I mentioned before, we're celebrating 50 years of the TAP application. So the TAP application started in 1974, and during that period of time, we have given out over $30 billion to help more than 6 million students access college and be able to pay for college. So those are some impressive numbers. TAP awards or any type of New York State award can range from anywhere from $100 to $5,665 for New York State TAP. TAP, unlike the federal application, is based on a family's New York State net taxable income. So it's the amount of money they pay taxes on, not their adjusted gross income. And this also includes pensions, untaxed income, any untaxed income they may have, as well as child support. So on the FAFSA form, a student may list child support as an asset. On the TAP application, it is listed as income. Income limits for New York State TAP can range from $10,000 to $80,000. For a independent student without dependents, the income cutoff is $10,000. For an independent student who's married with dependents or a dependent student, the income cutoff is $80,000 net taxable income. I also want to mention that students who complete the application and indicate that they are orphans, ward of the courts, or in foster care, their income is looked at the higher rate of $80,000 instead of $10,000. The 24-25 TAP application opened up on November 1st. The application deadline is still June 30th of 2025 for the 24-25 academic year. June 30th is a statutory application deadline date. The DREAM Act application for those individuals who don't meet the TAP citizenship requirements, that is also open. It's open year-round. And the FAFSA form is not required to submit the application this year. For the 24-25 application year, the FAFSA form is not required as a precursor to the TAP application. So they can do that now. The application is saved and it is processed upon receipt of the FAFSA. So the different pathways to the 24-25 TAP application. They have two options. The traditional option is for a student to complete the normal TAP application using our TAP on the web webpage, or they can go through the DREAM Act. And we're going to discuss both pathways. We're going to start with the DREAM Act. So students who do not meet citizenship eligibility for federal aid, such as they're being undocumented or they are DACA students, they can apply for New York State aid through the DREAM Act, the Senator Jose Peralta New York State DREAM Act. So students must meet New York State DREAM Act eligibility. Mike, in this presentation, is the eligibility laid out?
Yeah, we have in the next two slides, we talk
Okay.
about first we'll talk about the immigration status eligibility, and then the slide after that talks about the educational criteria.
Thank you. So in order to go through the DREAM Act, the student has two processes. They must complete the New York State DREAM Act eligibility application. The eligibility application determines if they meet DREAM Act criteria or if they meet regular student criteria or they don't meet any criteria at all. So on the DREAM Act eligibility application, it looks at their citizenship status, their education criteria, and students are required or may be required to upload documentation to support their eligibility. This documentation can include their citizenship status. It can include their proof of their high school graduation status or high school equivalency, and proof that they're eligible for New York State in-state tuition. For citizenship requirements, To be eligible for the DREAM Act, a student can have a T visa or a U visa. If they're on an F1 visa, which is a student visa, they are not eligible because they came here to the US for the purpose of going to school. They can also be in a temporary protected status. This is usually coming from countries that are in a war-torn country. They can also be deferred action for childhood arrivals, your DACA students, or they can just be without lawful immigration status. But the DREAM Act is not only for students who are unlawful, it can also be for eligible non-citizens whose permanent home is outside the state of New York. So they do have legal lawful status in the US, but they're just not New York State residents. There's also the criteria that they can meet by educational requirements. Sometimes when parents get their kids all out of school and they get them into college, they head south. They want to go to warmer weather, greener pastures. Well, when they leave the state of New York, their residency goes with them, and the student state of residency is typically the parent state of residency. So for parents in a similar situation like that, a student may go through the DREAM Act if they graduated from a New York State high school. They spent the last 2 years in a New York State high school. They can go through the DREAM Act and get New York State aid. If they hold a high school equivalency diploma, such as a GED or a TASC, they can be considered for New York State aid. And if they're charged in-state tuition at a CUNY, a State University of New York school, or City University of New York school for a reason other than New York State residents. So if they're charged in-state tuition at SUNY or CUNY, they can also be considered New York's eligible for the DREAM Act or eligible for TAP through the DREAM Act. Now, students also must enroll for undergraduate study at a college, New York State school, within 5 years of receiving their equivalency diploma. So to meet this criteria for education. Verifying high school graduation status. How do they do that? Well, students can opt for automatic verification through state ed, and the automatic verification, for that, we will need their New York State ed identification number. So for most students, that is not a number that they know. It is a number that you know because you have to submit every student, a list of students who are attending your high school to New York State Education Department, and that's where that information comes from. So students can verify high school graduation through that way. Once their eligibility has been determined for the DREAM Act, they will get an email notification that says their application has been approved. So once they get that, then they go back into their DREAM Act account, and then they can apply for TAP. So they will add an application, and the application that they're adding will be for the TAP application. The DREAM Act allows students to apply for any of the New York State programs that we have. So let's talk about the traditional pathway. This website may be very familiar to people who are used to helping students fill out the TAP application. So students can start the TAP application right now from our homepage by clicking on Apply Now, because the application is open for the 24-25 year. Students who are going through the traditional pathway must meet citizenship requirements for federal. The same citizenship requirements that are required for federal aid are also required for New York State aid through the traditional pathway. And the student still needs to complete the FAFSA form. So even though they can do the TAP application early, the FAFSA is still required in order for us to process the TAP application. So TAP applications processed without the FAFSA form. Right now, The application says it has a deadline of the saved application has a deadline of February 15th. We want the FAFSA form by February 15th. Right now, based on when we created when we created the TAP application for the 50th anniversary, federal student aid had not announced that states would not be receiving data from them to pre-populate their state forms. So now that we know that we're not getting pre-populated TAP applications, we're keeping the application out there, and we will review this February 15th deadline as we start to receive ISAR information from federal student aid to see if we're going to keep the deadline or if we're going to just have applications out there for a longer period of time. So more information will come out on that as we see how everything unfolds with the FAFSA form. Every student who fills out a TAP application must verify their identity through a HESC PIN. So when they access the application, when they click on the link to apply, they're prompted to create an account, a username and password, and a PIN number. So for many of our students, they can verify their identity through DMV if they have a New York State driver's license or New York State ID. Some can verify their identity through New York State Education Department. And then there's some whose identity may not get verified until we receive their FAFSA information. But in order to, they can still do the TAP application, but in order to get an award, their identity does have to be verified. So that's part of the application processing. If we're not able to verify the identity, they do get information from us on what their next steps should be. One other thing I want to say too, before talking about the FAFSA confirmation page, is that I don't know about you, but when we send emails to students, they have a tendency to ignore our emails. And then they call and say, well, I haven't heard from you. Well, they need to read their email. So we encourage you, and I'm sure you're already doing it, to have students read their emails. And sometimes students submit an email address that they don't necessarily monitor all the time. But if they're looking for money from the federal or from the state, they need to check the email on a regular basis because that is the primary means of communication. So it's not that we haven't sent them anything. It says New York State Higher Education Services Corporation. And I've sat with students and seen many, many, many emails from us that they've ignored. So we are communicating with them, but they need to check their email on a regular basis. So this too, for the 24-25 for the FAFSA confirmation page link, when students click on it, it will not have a pre-populated TAP application. It will still take them to a TAP application, but they'll have to enter that information all over again because it's not pre-populated from the FAFSA. That is another significant change for 24-25. So with there being no prior information from the FAFSA, this is a screenshot of what the TAP application may look like. They will have to key in all of their information. So no pre-filled data. There's no changes to the TAP application itself. It's still pretty much the same as it has been for several years. And this is an application that Mike Turner will walk through for the on the FAFSA and TAP training that we will have on January 5th. As I said, our requirements remain unchanged. So there is something that is still the same for the financial aid application process. Custodial income information is used for the TAP application. The state of New York, state law has not changed the definition of parent. So therefore, the TAP application is still looking at custodial parent information. Custodial parent information is this parent with whom the student lives. Adjustments can also still be made for students who are attending with households that have more than one family member attending college. And the household size is the household of this household size of the custodial parent. So whereas the FAFSA has major changes in this area, the state of New York does not. When students complete their application, they can review their application information through their HESC PIN account. They can log into their HESC PIN account and click on Student Access here in yellow and get information. They can update their PIN information if their email changes or they want to change their PIN number. They can review their financial aid information. They can update their college code or record. Whereas the federal form takes 20 college codes, the state of New York can only take one because our award is tied to the tuition at that school. So they can update the college code once they've made their final decision, usually around May 1st, sometime between May and June. So they can do all of that information through their HESC account. So, and they can also upload documentation. If we're requesting information from them, if we needed information to verify their citizenship, verify their residency status, or if they wanted to appeal any part of their application, they would go to their account to be able to upload the documents. Once they upload the document, they can see that it's uploaded and we get a notification, we get information, we get that document, we get a notification that there's a document out there on this student's behalf, and we go in and we pull that document and process it. Once we process documents, the student is sent an email that their account information has been updated, and it does tell them what has been updated, but it's in fine print and there's a lot of print and they have to read the whole thing. So sometimes students don't like to read and they'll call and say, I can't tell what's changed, but it does tell them what has changed. It also tells them if a request to be considered independent has been approved or not. It does not tell them a reason. It just says approved or denied. And so they just need to read the information. So we have a few more other updates that we want to make you aware of. All of our programs, if you go to our website at hesc.ny.gov and click on pay, it will bring up a list of all the New York State's grants and scholarships and incentive programs, as well as loan forgiveness programs that we have. So here is like when you click on pay, and you'll see New York State grants, New York State scholarships and awards, and we have the student loan forgiveness programs. So, but the first two tabs are all the programs that the state of New York has. The state of New York has 28 different grants, scholarships, incentives, and loan forgiveness programs, and they're all listed on this tab, along with what is available from the federal student aid as well. So if you're looking to see what the Excelsior deadline date is, or the Excelsior when the application may open for a specific term, you'll find it here under Excelsior. And speaking of Excelsior, the application for currently enrolled college students, so not your high school students, but currently enrolled college students, is expected to open up later on this month. We don't have an exact date yet that we can publish or let you know at this point in time, but it will be announced very soon. And once that application opens up, it's for the students who are currently enrolled in college. And sometimes we'll have high school students submitting their application when they're still in high school. The application opens up on a per term basis based on budgetary requirements. So they have to make sure that there's enough money to cover anticipated awards for each term of enrollment, fall and spring. So that is why it opens up in the fall, and in the spring is not at this point in time, it's not an annual application. For new students, they have to apply by the term. If they have already been awarded TAP, they don't have to reapply again. The income cutoff for the Excelsior program is based on federal adjusted gross income, and the income cutoff currently is $125,000 unless that is changed in budget negotiations for the 24-25 year. So as of right now, $125,000 is the adjusted gross income cutoff for Excelsior. And again, we don't want high school students applying in the spring semester. Their application should open up around, I think it is July, August timeframe. If on the tab, in the prior screen we showed you on the tab for Excelsior, you can click on Excelsior and they can sign up to receive notifications about the program, including when the application opens. New York State Scholarships for Academic Excellence. This scholarship is awarded by New York State Department of Education. So we just administer the program. Basically, we make payments on behalf of state ed. If students have any questions about the application criteria, they need to contact state ed, and the contact information is listed here. But these nominations are done by you. So you submit your nominations to state ed notifies students, and then they also notify us so that we can pay the student once we receive their TAP application. The student does have to submit a payment application, which is basically the TAP application, in order to receive their Academic Excellence Award, to receive the funding from it. School counselor resources. When you go to our website, in purple here, where it says partner access, when you click on partner access, it will either say financial aid administrator or school counselor. And when you click on school counselors, you'll see we have resources out here that includes our newsletter, links to different areas, different resources for flyers and additional information on different programs, deadlines, and things of that nature. We also have handouts. The handouts, I will say, have not fully been updated for the 24-25 year, but we expect to have them ready by January, mid-January. So you can download handouts and fact sheets on the different programs. And then you can always, if you have questions, you can always reach out to us through pre-college services. And my email address was on the first presentation as well. Now, this is my favorite topic, the FAFSA Completion Initiative. Here in the Syracuse area, I've been helping schools in the local area do FAFSA events for 15 years. And I haven't aged at all in that 15-year time period. But over the past 15 years, we have been doing FAFSA completion initiatives. And FAFSA completion initiatives are great when you can see the end results of all the work that you've done. The FAFSA completion initiative helps you see that end result. So sometimes your principal or supervisor may send you information from the FAFSA tracker that tells you, oh, you have, for your school, the FAFSA completion rate is 19%. And you know good and well, you've helped a whole bunch of students at your school complete the application, and it should be higher than 19%. So it's looking at the number of graduates anticipated for that particular year as reported by state ed. So the FAFSA completion initiative, whereas the FAFSA tracker gives you aggregated information, we give you student level information. And that student level information is awesome because a student may have told you to your face, yes, ma'am, I submitted that form, when they really didn't. Okay. So with the FAFSA completion initiative, you sign up, you sign our electronic agreement to access information from our site. None of the information you are accessing is personally identifiable information. We already know the students who are attending your school. So from the list that we get from state ed, we can tell you by student, one, has a FAFSA been submitted? Okay. So if the FAFSA has been submitted, is it complete or is it pending a signature page or is it being rejected? And we can tell you if they've done their TAP application. That's the information you want to know in order to know which student you need to be talking to make sure that they do the financial aid form. So I encourage you that if you don't know if you're signed up, check with your principal or superintendent. And if you're signed up, you may need to have them give you access to get the information. Once the FAFSA starts being processed, so sometime around February, we should start getting FAFSA information from the U.S. Department of Education. So when federal student aid starts sending us that information, then we start making it available to you. And you can tell which students have done the forms. So initially, it may not matter who's done it, but come March and April, it does matter because you want these students to get the best award package that they can. And some students will get acceptance letters, but they won't know how much money they have to go to that school. So I know you do an awful lot of work to help your kids. This is a tool that you can have that will reduce the amount of work you have to do because it reduces the number of students you have to keep going to. So I do encourage you to see if you're signed up for it. And if not, you can reach out to me and I'll send you the form. And you fill out the form and our agency will send you a username and password. The form does have to be submitted by your superintendent for your school district. But, you know, superintendents act faster if there's a little pressure from you to say, hey, we need this form to help increase our FAFSA completion rate. So tips for FAFSA completions. Sometimes a school will say, my high school is not listed. The high schools show up based on how they're reported to the U.S. Department of Education. So if you don't see your high school, you need to work with your administration to whoever that individual is that communicates the information to state ed and the U.S. Department of Education, update that information. Grade level is something that is also maybe misreported when the student files the FAFSA. If you want the student, if the student will show up in the FAFSA completion if they indicated that they have never attended or if this is their first year of college. Sometimes they think that graduating from high school is part of college attendance because they may have taken college level courses. They have not physically sat in a college classroom. So that does not count. So they should indicate never attended first year. And you can always check your naming convention because sometimes we have found that some schools have different names for the same school. The names may need to be consolidated for it to show up on your FAFSA completion list. And that is the state update in a very short nutshell. So, Mike, are you still there?
Yeah,
At
I'm
least-
here.
okay.
Not too many state aid questions. There was in the beginning, and then someone had repeated this. There was some other meeting or some other venue where
The
another
SUNY Oppenheim. Is
yeah,
that
somebody had said not to file the TAP application because it was going to cause a bunch of problems. Can you just dispel that, what we're doing
yeah.
for folks who are filing it before the FAFSA?
So the SUNY Oppenheim meeting, that was the information that when they were given the information, when they asked about, what's the best way, they were given two options. But most of us are used to doing the TAP application at the end of the FAFSA form. So if you wanted to go for simplicity, then that was the option at that point in time because we knew the FAFSA data was going to transfer. Then, just a couple of weeks ago, federal student aid reached out to the 7 state agencies that use the FAFSA data and told us in a meeting that they were not going to be able to transfer the FAFSA data to the state application. So at the Oppenheim, we thought everything was going to be status quo. Now that there's been a change from federal student aid, you can do the TAP application at any time. So there's 3 ways, okay? So you can do the TAP application right now. It's saved. Once we get the FAFSA, we'll process it. You can do the TAP application at the end of the FAFSA. And once we get the FAFSA information, we'll process it. Students, right now, we know we won't get FAFSA information until towards the middle to end of January. So we can't process until we start getting that information. And we will probably do it on a regimented process because it'll be a lot of information coming in all at once. So because there'll be all the applications processed at once. So students can also wait until they get the email from us to say, hey, we got your FAFSA data, but we don't have a TAP application. If they click on the link that's in the email from us, if they click on the link, then that application will be pre-populated because we are pre-populating it from the information we get from their FAFSA. So even though the federal can't do it, we can do it in-house. So there's 3 ways that they can submit the application, but all 3 ways we rely on the FAFSA. And we know the FAFSA is delayed not only to students, but also to colleges and state agencies. So just have them do the application. Either way that makes it, the most comfortable for the student.
Sonia, can you talk about the gender on FAFSA? So there's a question, and I think it's important that we address it. If someone is of transgender or of no gender identity, how they answer those questions now that there's no selective service requirement.
Right. So those questions, the gender identity and the ethnicity questions have absolutely no bearing on a student's financial aid eligibility, none whatsoever, and they are optional. So a student does not have to answer them. There is an option at the end of each question. It's either prefer not to answer or something. So they don't have to indicate if they don't want to. So those questions it's for research purposes. Some people want to know, how many students, how many females are receiving federal student aid as opposed to males. Okay. So those are for federal, only for aggregated reporting and research purposes only.
And then we're still getting some questions and confusion about independent students. So a question just came in saying that if the student was under legal guardianship, once they turn 18, they're no longer under legal guardianship. How do they file their FAFSA? They're still independent. So go ahead.
Right. So if they are in a legal guardianship situations end at 18, but they're still considered in a legal guardianship situation for financial aid purposes for federal or state. So if they were in a legal guardianship situation, then they're considered independent for federal student aid and for New York State TAP.
And another question came in, how long if the students are going under the flow where they're going to wait to do FAFSA prior to filing the TAP application, how long until we request them to file TAP once we get their FAFSA?
So once we get their FAFSA, we wait 14 days. Well, okay. Once we get their TAP application, we wait 14 days for the FAFSA.
Yep. So they're
I'm
asking
sorry.
the way around. The student files the FAFSA first in January or wherever.
Yeah. So if we get their ISAR, once we get their
Do you guys have
ISAR,
to finish that, or how does that work?
So once we get their ISAR, we wait 14 days for them to do the TAP application. If we don't get the TAP application after 14 days, our system automatically sends them an email that says, hey, we have your FAFSA information. Please, you should consider applying for New York State aid. And then they get a notice every 14 days from that point forward to do their TAP application.
I don't see anything else new coming in. There was a couple questions saying like if a student's not income eligible for TAP, should they still go through the FAFSA process? Should they still apply? You want to just comment on how FAFSA is used not only for Pell Grants, but for institutional aid. And then also if they're looking for Excelsior, they may still want to file with us.
Right. I encourage it doesn't hurt to file the FAFSA, even if a student doesn't think they're eligible. If they want a student loan, they still have to do the FAFSA. If the parents want to borrow a federal student loan, they still have to do the FAFSA. So it doesn't hurt them. Plus, schools use the FAFSA to determine need-based eligibility for their institutional programs. Some scholarships are need-based. Some grants at the institutional level are need-based. So it does not hurt them to file for aid. Every student who meets the citizenship requirements is eligible for federal student aid as long as they're not in default. They may not like the kind of aid they get because a student loan is aid, but every student is eligible. So should the student should allow the school to tell them, hey, this is what you're eligible for, as opposed to disqualifying themselves. I've had families who made an income and they thought it was too high for them to get financial aid. And actually, based on the federal calculations, they were eligible for federal aid. They were eligible for grant money and never knew it because it's not looking at just income. It's looking at household size, number in college in some cases, depending on the school, and other things. It's a formula. So it's not just based on income. It's a federal formula. It's a complicated formula. And we even teach financial aid administrators how to know that formula so they can understand the end results that they're getting.
And then some more clarification on independent situations. It always tends to be a popular topic. Will a student who's an expected parent, they're going to have a child, are they considered independent when applying? Are they considered emancipated? Like, how does that work if the student will have a child?
Okay, that's a good question. So for federal purposes, if a student has a child that they are supporting, then they can be considered independent as long as that child is born during the academic school year. That's for federal financial aid. However, if that child is going to be claimed, if the student and the child are living with the parent, then most colleges will consider that student dependent, because the roof over their head is being provided by someone other than the student. And if the child is going to be claimed by the parents, it's not the student's dependent, it's the parent's dependent. So therefore, the student is counted as dependent for federal student aid purposes. But New York State TAP, if a student has a child under the age of 22, if the student is under the age of 22 and they have a child, they'll have to provide us with documentation indicating that they're supporting that child. So they'll need to provide proof in the form of a tax return, a tax transcript, a New York State tax transcript indicating that they have claimed that child, or a birth certificate and proof of separate addresses from their parents, because we want to know where they're living, because the TAP application looks at the amount of support and where they're living to prove dependency status. If they're over the age of 22, then and pregnant, then we would need the information once the baby is born. So we need a birth certificate and proof that they're living at a separate address than their parents. And
Yep,
there's a date. The date, is it December 31st, Mike, or January 1?
Yeah, this is pretty much the same thing, December 31st.
Okay.
Just want to clarify that, right? Because sometimes I get, I've had in the past too, like a young man who's fathering a child from another student, in the high school, and that student claims that they have a child, but they don't live with the girlfriend, they don't work, they don't provide any money, they just happen to have made a child. They just can't claim that they have a child and be independent, right?
Right. Right.
Yep. So there's some questions coming in about the SAE. I just want to emphasize that the scholarships for academic excellence, if you didn't receive your nomination packet, if you were wondering how many scholarships you can give to your students, there's a $1,500 or $500 scholarship, the amount of scholarships you're allowed to nominate for. All of that is administered by the New York State Education Department, not by HESC. I put in chat a link to their site where they have their contact information, the rules and requirements of nominating students for the SAE. You really should be reaching out to them to clarify whether or not you've received your packet, and also on how many awards you're allowed to give. That's usually indicated in your nomination packets when you receive them. That deadline is coming up in February, so you'd want to reach out to them as soon as possible if you haven't received your nomination packets. We really can't provide any assistance with you on the front end of this Once you've made your nominations and we've been notified and we're awarding students, then we can help you with making sure your students are awarded and that that money is being reflected on with their colleges. But this early onset nominating your students, you have to work with SED. I'm just looking to see if there's anything else new that's coming in.
So there's a question about the FSA ID process for those without a social security number.
Yep, that
Yes,
one.
so that one, the FSA ID site for people without a social security number will open up the same time as the FAFSA. So we don't even have any information about the site at all. It's going to go live with the FAFSA. And I think a lot of that has to do with protecting the identity of individuals who be considered, who are considered unlawful here in the US. So at HESC, we don't share information about DREAM Act students, and the feds are trying to do the same thing for those individuals who must sign the FAFSA form, but don't have an FSA, a social security number.
I don't see anything new or unanswered. If somebody feels like their question has not been answered, just make sure you just punch it back into chat. But for now, I think we're good.
Mark, I hope this was very helpful.
Very helpful and very informative. Very, very informative.
A little overwhelming because we're overwhelmed. So I'm sure that you guys are overwhelmed, but I encourage you to take advantage of the webinars that Federal Student Aid is offering, and any training that's been done locally in your area or by the state. We update our training information as well, because we're still being trained ourselves. I take advantage of all these training opportunities because I like to train others so that we can help our students get into college. I want to know that when I'm in the nursing home, that the people who are taking care of me have been well trained. Okay, it's a little selfish of me right now, but that's my goal.
Well, Sonia, on behalf of the association and our president, Marjorie and I have been texting that we were really happy that we're middle school counselors.
I
But
bow to all of you, and wow.
we thank you and Michael and your entire team for this webinar. The recording for the webinar will be shared on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. The PowerPoints will be shared, and the chats with all of the information in the chats will be shared as soon as I get it all together to everyone who's attended or registered. Thanks for your time. Thanks for all the information. It's amazing.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This
You're
has
welcome.
been eye-opening on so many different levels.
Have a great day, everyone.
You too.
You